Alright, so recently I came across a few tweets or posts on X where a prominent YouTuber suggested to rather buy an RTX 4060 GPU and play at 4K because 4K low settings are better than 1440p ultra settings, right? And I'm not here to debate that at all. I mean, that's a personal opinion, but it got me thinking, and what if the RTX 4060 is actually capable of doing 4K properly? All right, so we'll be testing 10 games today. I'll be testing at 4K mostly. I'll be showing you some differences between 1440p and 4K when it comes to different settings. But at the moment, we are in The Witcher 3. This is in DX12 mode. We're at 4K and we are on the low preset, right? I am outside somewhere here, and this is actually a pretty demanding area. And as you can see, we are getting 60 frames per second here. Right, let me just reset the numbers there, and I'm just going to do my usual short run in this villager. This is where most of my Witcher benchmarking is taking place, as it is quite demanding. But you can see we are maintaining 60 frames per second here, pretty much. I mean, it's dipping below 60 every now and again. But as I said, this is a pretty demanding area because of all the foliage and all the NPCs are maybe not as intensive as a Velen or so, but we are mostly CPU bound in Velen with this specific system, so it'll be kind of pointless to test CPU bound scenarios when we are testing GPUs. All right, so just this short run, 60 frames per second average. Our lows are pretty respectable as well. 51 frames per second at 1% lows and 0.1% lows at 48. The only issue is that texture detail seems to be lacking, for a lack of better words. Personally, I wouldn't mind the 60 frames per second, especially at 4K, but this doesn't look good, even though the pixel density is much higher at 4K. I don't think this is great, but I'm going to be recording this in 4K. I'm going to be uploading it in 4K, my first 4K YouTube video. You can decide for yourself whether this is worth it to you or not. I'm not here to pass judgment on that. All right, but just to give you an idea, let's just go into 1440p here. I just can't never remember where it is. So we'll drop down to 1440p, and then I'm just going to up the settings a bit. Right, so at 1440p, let's just go with the high settings for now. We won't be doing any ray tracing. I'm just selecting presets here, and there's no upscaling here happening either. Right, so just immediately the texture detail is much better, right? And we're still getting 60 frames per second. I'm just doing a small turn here. You can see the armor, Geralt's hair, everything is just so much better, right? So we're getting more or less the same performance, just at 1440p high. All right, so that's going to be it for The Witcher. Let's move on to the next one. All right, so next up we've got Cyberpunk 2077. This is with the Phantom Liberty update and update 2.01 as well. We're just going to select the low preset here. I'm just going to disable FSR, right? And we're at 4K, I believe. Yep, at 4K. And we're in the market area at the stadium. It is quite intensive there as well. And let's just see if FSR did disable. It did. All right, so let's just reset our numbers here, and let's do our run. Now, Cyberpunk is extremely intensive and difficult to run, and as you can see at 4K we're getting 40 frames per second, right? So that's not the main issue. We can obviously use DLSS or FSR, whichever one you prefer, but if you do have an NVIDIA GPU, then obviously use DLSS because it does have the better image quality. To lower the internal resolution and try to get a playable frame rate with the final output being 4K, which is not 4K native. Don't get the two confused, and I'm not saying it's 4K native either, for those in the comments section. But as you can see, 4K native is definitely not a playable experience unless you are aiming for 4K 30. That's perfectly fine if that is your goal as well. But personally, I'd prefer a much higher frame rate. I prefer a higher refresh rate experience, and 4060 and 4K is not going to give that to us. Right, so let's see what we need to do to get to 60 frames per second here. Right, so we'll have to play with the DLSS super resolution here. Let's just see if balanced is getting us 60. All right, so DLSS balanced 60 frames per second it is. Let me just reset the numbers. And I mean, motion smoothness already is much improved. I'm pretty sure we'll drop below 60 frames per second as we did there. Not the end of the world. We're dropping down to 59 frames per second. And when the final upscaled resolution is 4K, it still looks pretty good, even if you have to use performance DLSS. I'll put up the DLSS resolution scale on the screen right now, so you can actually see what the internal resolution is. I can't remember all these numbers, but all in all, this isn't terrible, right? 60 frames per second, definitely doable in a game like Cyberpunk. The game looks pretty good. Unfortunately, with DLSS, you'll still see some artifacting that's maybe not there at the native resolution, but all in all, this is definitely not the worst experience I've had. So for Cyberpunk, I'm not going to drop the resolution down. This was a pretty decent experience. The game looks pretty good at low. Shadows, etc. will be a bit of an issue, so you might lose some immersion. It would come across as if people are floating because their shadows aren't really connected to them or the ground, but small compromises have to be made. Alright, so let's move on to the next one. Right, so next up we have Batman Arkham Knight. The resolution is at 4K. I don't think there are presets here. Let me just figure that one out. Right, so these are the settings I settled on. We do have anti-aliasing enabled and anisotropic filtering because a trilinear filtering just looks terrible, and this doesn't really affect performance that much, and texture resolution also doesn't really. It just increases the VRAM usage, but I'm going to stick to the low preset here. Max FPS is set to 90 and VSync needs to be disabled, right? So the only reason why I'm testing this game is it's quite old, right? So it's just this is going to be my old game in the arsenal for testing. And despite being an old game, it still holds up by today's standards. I mean, even on low, I just dig his suit. Sure, enhanced rain is not enabled. Nothing is set to high at all except for anisotropic filtering. And this game does look pretty good. And I do suspect we should be able to maintain... I was lying. I was going to say we should be able to maintain our 90 frames per second frame cap there. But that didn't happen. I'm not going to be testing a Batman for too long. I've got no idea how to play the game with the keyboard and a mouse. I play this on a controller. Anyway, so I don't think we reset the numbers. So while I get beat up here, let me just reset the numbers so we can get a decent representation of the lows there. And this is definitely not a terrible experience either. I know it's an older game, as I said. It still looks good. It's still plenty fun. A lot of people seem to dislike the Batmobile mechanic in this game. I kind of enjoy it, but that's just me. All right, so I mean, just during a normal fighting scene, I don't know how to run. We got around 80 frames per second here. So if you do cap the frame rate to 60, you can see our 0.1% lows are pretty close to 60 as well. So just cap your frame rate to 60 and you'll have a pretty good experience, right? Right, but I'm not going to be testing too many settings here. Actually, I'm not going to change any settings. The argument was that 4K low is perfectly playable. It's more preferred than 1440p or 1080p ultra. And I'm just here to test the frame rates. All right, and it's acceptable in my opinion. All right, so now it's time we move on to an Unreal Engine 5 game. And we're going to be aiming for 240 frames per second here. Actually, that's not going to happen. So we're at 4K and I'm just going to go down to the low preset here without enabling any upscaling. So let's just enable the low preset. Yeah, then okay, it actually enables FSR Ultra Performance there. So not what we want. So we'll just stick to the low preset and just disable FSR here. Right, and there's our settings, 4K low native. And let's just reset our numbers here. And we are getting more or less the same as what we had with Cyberpunk at 4K native, right? In the 30s. So once again, if you're aiming for a 30 frames per second experience at 4K, then I mean, this is definitely doable. It's just, once again, personally, I wouldn't prefer something like this. Once you actually play on a high refresh rate monitor at very high frame rates, 30 frames per second does become quite jarring. I used to play a lot of games on console and 30 frames per second didn't bother me. But at the moment, after having gotten used to a high refresh rate experience, 30 frames per second is it's just not great, right? So, but that's my personal opinion. I know a lot of people who play at 30 frames per second who don't have an issue with that at all. So if that's your aim, this game can definitely do it at native or this GPU. And if we need to get 60 frames per second, let's see what we need to enable to do that. Let's go for the balance preset once again. I think that should be almost enough, and it's not really. I think we'll have to use DLSS performance here. Right, it's close enough to 60 frames per second. I'd say if you've got a 60 hertz monitor, then I mean this is actually pretty decent, but to get a constant 60 frames per second, you might just need to use a little bit more aggressive upscaling, right? Especially once you start casting spells, you can see that we are dropping into the high 40s there. All right, so let's just see what we actually need to do to get 60 frames per second constant. As I said, I do believe we need to go to performance. You can actually see the FPS change in the top left hand corner if once we change presets here. So it seems like ultra performance is the only one that gives us a 60 frames per second in the menu, or well, while the game is playing in the background. But I think if we go back into the game, it should be fine. And I mean, not a big difference in the frame rate, so maybe balance is just the better option to use, because you do get slightly better visuals as the internal resolution is slightly higher. But that would completely depend on how often it drops below 50 frames per second anyway. All right, so that's it for Forspoken. On to the next one. All right, so while we are busy with the Unreal Engine 5 games, we've got Remnant 2 up next. We're at 4K at the moment. No VSync, frame rate is unlocked, no upscaling, and on the low preset, right? I did disable detailed shadows and detailed geometry. Unreal Engine 5 games are pretty demanding, not always justified, but that's just how it goes. And luckily Remnant doesn't really suffer from too much stuttering that I could find. I haven't played it for too long, but the few hours that I have played seem to indicate that stuttering is not too big an issue in this particular game. Right, let me just reset our numbers here, and I crouched for some reason. What's crouched? There we go. All right, so at 4K native, we're getting 30 frames per second here, 36, 37. Now this area is very easy to render. Just as soon as we exit these ruins, just getting into the more open world stuff, the frame rate will drop considerably. And I mean, then it's not a good experience, not even if you are aiming for 4K 30, as we are dropping below 30 frames per second often. Right, so definitely not the best way to experience this game. Right, so let's just see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second here. I'm going to be standing in this specific area because I actually just want to show you something as well. Right, so if we want to up our frame rate, we'll have to play around with the upscalers here. I know we can enable DLSS frame generation here, just that if you have 30 frames per second, you enable it, your input latency will just go through the roof, and that's just not ideal at all. So we'll just use DLSS here, and I think let's just start off with balanced as we did with all the other games. Let's see if we can get to 60 frames per second, and I mean it'll drop below 60, okay, more often than not. Right, so 50 frames per second. So I think actually we'll do DLSS performance here, right? Right, so let's just reset our numbers there, and looking this way, getting 80 frames per second, going in this direction, we are pretty much at 60 frames per second. This is actually not a terrible experience. This is pretty good. This is on a 4K 60 Hz monitor, so at this frame rate there's not any tearing, even though it is slightly above the monitor's refresh rate. In this scenario, I probably wouldn't mind playing like this, even though I do still prefer a higher refresh rate experience, but this is definitely acceptable. Right, so just one thing that I want to show you here. So the main reason why I'm in this specific area is I just want to show you lose a lot of detail if you play on low. I'm just going to up the preset here to high. Let's just show you, like, there's just a lot more detail when you actually up the quality settings, right? And I mean, it makes sense. The texture detail, everything gets increased, the lighting, the particle effects, everything. So this just looks a lot more full, and the world just looks a lot better. But now we are dipping below 50 frames per second a lot of the times here, and I'd say we are pretty much in the vicinity where I'd be comfortable enabling frame generation. The only issue is when I tested this yesterday, frame generation in this game doesn't seem to be doing much at 4K on this 4060, right? So let's just see. Right, so still getting 60 frames per second here, and and this, so it's still dipping below 60 even with frame generation. And I've seen this with a few games. The frame rate is definitely slightly higher, but nothing close to that usual 33 to 50% performance improvement I usually see. It's just that I believe that this GPU at 4K is just so overutilized. What? I thought they're friendly. It's just so overutilized that I don't think frame generation can do much at this stage. Alright, so that's Remnant for you. So let's move on to the next Unreal Engine 5 game. And the next game we've got on our list is Robocop Rogue City. The only reason why I included this is because it's also an Unreal Engine 5 game. There's a demo out on Steam, which is free. The demo actually received an update yesterday, I believe, which was 38 gigs. The demo was 38 gigs to download, and then the update was 38 gigs as well. And it seems to have improved a lot of the initial stuttering issues that I had with the game. Right, so just on 4K on the low preset, I'm on windowed mode because if I enable full screen mode, it's not really going into full screen. I only see like a quarter of the display then. Anyway, so let's just go ahead and apply these settings. Now, one thing that I just want to note whilst the game is loading in, I've had quite a few crashes with this GPU at 4K. I just believe we are running out of resources. It's just not strong enough to run at 4K, and the game crashes a lot of time. As soon as I drop this down to 1080p, then the crashing stops. All right, so let's just enable our frame rate counter there and reset our numbers. And I mean, this is definitely not a good experience, like not good at all. One thing that this game does well is it's got no ray tracing, but the reflections aren't terrible. If we actually up the detail, this does look quite okay actually. Right, but on the low preset we're getting 27 frames per second. As you can see, the frame time graph is very inconsistent, but none of that initial stuttering that I saw when the demo first released. So I think that fixed that update, that huge 38 gig update, fixed a lot of the initial stuttering issues, and we'll see that once I enter this building as well. Right, so just one thing that I have to note is that you can lower your resolution, obviously, and not have to rely on upscaling. Remember, upscaling also has a performance penalty. If I play at 4K on DLSS performance, which renders instantly at 1080p, I do get a lower frame rate than if I had to play at 1080p native, right? So DLSS still has some performance overheads, or any upscaling actually. The issue is that if you go out and buy a 4K monitor and pair it with a 4060, if you lower the resolution, the monitor is then responsible for upscaling to 4K, and some monitors just don't handle that very well. It looks pretty bad. It becomes very blurry, very soft. So if you buy a 4K monitor, you're going to be stuck with a 4K resolution, right? And you'll have to use in-game settings or upscaling to get around that. I mean, this is definitely not playable and doesn't look great. But let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second here. Right, so for us to get 60 frames per second, we have to use DLSS Ultra Performance. DLSS Performance doesn't cut it. Ultra Performance is the only DLSS preset that gets us 60 frames per second. And now you are rendering internally at 720p, right? You can enable DLSS frame generation once again, but let's just test it without frame generation, and let's reset our numbers here while I'm busy dying. And as you can see, we are pretty much getting 60 frames per second. I saw some areas where it dropped below 60. Sometimes it's even higher into the 80s. One thing that I do like about this game is the destruction mechanic. It takes me back to Red Faction, which is quite an old game, but the destruction mechanic in that game was pretty impressive. Right, so you can see dipping below 60 frames per second every now and again. Not the end of the world, but I mean, it doesn't look great. One thing that I did notice though is if we enable frame generation in this title, the input latency is actually reduced. And the reason for that is you can't manually enable NVIDIA Reflex in this game, right? The moment you enable frame generation or DLSS 3, Reflex gets enabled automatically, but the game menu does not have an option to enable Reflex. And that's why the input latency is lower when you enable frame generation. All right, so to get 60 frames per second here, DLSS Ultra Performance, you'll have to decide whether that's worth it to you or not. Personally, I don't think so, but I mean, off we go. All right, so our next game is The Last of Us Part 1. Now, this one is notorious for its poor PC performance and especially high VRAM usage. It seems like they fixed that now. We're at 4K with no upscaling, and we are just below our 8GB VRAM buffer that's available to us. And I just want to verify the settings here. Right, so the moment we drop down to the low preset, it actually goes to 6.5GB required, right? So, I mean, that's just an estimation, but it does give you an idea of what to expect more or less. Right, this is where I do all my benchmarking for The Last of Us Part 1. It's a very demanding scene, and I mean, you can see on low, because of the draw distance, there's already some issues, right? So that rock is not spawning in unless you get very close. But it's getting 40 frames per second. Now, I'd argue that in a game like The Last of Us Part 1, 40 frames per second is not the worst experience. It's a very, very slow-paced game. But once there's some action on the screen, you actually have to start shooting people. 30 to 40 frames per second is just definitely not ideal. The input latency is much higher. The motion fluidity is much lower. And I mean, you can't actually even see that this is water, right? I mean, you can see from the splashes and stuff, but on low, this is definitely not a very good looking game. I mean, it is one of the better looking games on PC, just not at these settings. All right, so what do we need to do to get 60 frames per second here? Right, so there's two things we can do. We can actually adjust the render resolution scale, so then it just uses built-in upscaling, or we can use DLSS or FSR. So for this, we'll obviously use DLSS Super Resolution, and I think performance mode was the only mode I could actually get 60 frames per second. Yeah, let's just see. All right, sure. So getting 70 frames per second, 80. Maybe we can go to DLSS balanced. Maybe that'll get us 60 still. All right, so DLSS balanced it is. Right, so you can just see, look at the edges of the pond there, a lot of shimmering going on there. So that's just what you get with upscaling. There will be some visual artifacting, etc. I'm not going to argue at 4K, the game definitely looks very sharp. You can see all the finer detail in the foliage, etc. It's just that low is a pretty big compromise to make just to get a sharper image, because you lose out on a lot more detail. Now, let me just show you this water. If we just up this to medium. So once we up it to medium, you can see our VRAM usage increases quite a bit there. I'll just have to apply and restart. Right, we're back. We didn't have to restart the game. It just reloads the checkpoint. Now, this does look quite a lot better. I mean, you be the judge of that. I'm not going to tell you what looks better and what not. To me personally, this looks a lot better. Still getting around 60 frames per second, even though it'll drop below 60 quite often. But now you can actually see that the water has got some reflections going on there. And now it actually somewhat represents water. And I think, I mean, this is still fine. You can play at 4K medium preset here. Just expect a few dips below 50 frames per second, even during some intense fighting scenes. So it's definitely up to you how you want to play it. Right? Do you want to use 4K on the low preset and not get much world detail but increased sharpness, or do you just play at a lower resolution, up the details a bit so you can actually see what's going on in the game? I mean, that's personally what I would have done, but once again, the choice is yours to make. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Right, so next up, we've got Spider-Man. We're at 4K here. We've got the low preset enabled, and these are all the settings here, and no upscaling or frame generation is enabled. All right, so let's just reset our numbers here. Like, why are we getting exactly 60 frames per second? I thought I disabled the VSync. Sorry, one thing that I did leave enabled was dynamic resolution scanning. That is now disabled, and for some reason we are locked at 60 frames per second, even though VSync is disabled, and VSync in video control panel is also disabled. Got no idea why we are locked to 60 even if we look down. All right, okay, so it's not going to go above 60 frames per second here, unfortunately. Just maybe something wrong on my side. So let's just swing around through the city. And I'm impressed. I mean, we're getting a pretty solid 60 frames per second here. Our lows aren't terrible either. I know I'm swinging like an idiot, and not focusing at all on the swinging here. But I mean, dropping below 60 there just for a a second or two, but I'd say this is pretty close to a 60 frames per second experience, or as close as you'll get to it anyway. I mean, the 0.1% low sitting at 44, that's quite impressive. Once again on the low preset, so you'll have to make the choice whether you want to sacrifice more detail for more sharpness or clarity, however you want to justify it. And we can definitely see that VSync is not enabled. There's a lot of tearing, so got no idea why there's a frame rate limit of 60. Anyway, if this is how I was supposed to play the game on a daily basis, I obviously wouldn't mind. There's definitely just some lower resolution textures and some lower detail settings, which is quite obvious. I mean, just a texture detail in that sign. I mean, I'm just pointing out arbitrary things here. But I mean, 4K 60 on an RTX 4060, not the worst experience I've had with this game so far. All right, so that's going to be it. Let's move on to the next one. All right, so next up, we've got Ratchet and Clank. All right, another Insomniac title, another title ported from the PS5 to the PC. And this one actually looks pretty good. At 4K, I mean, just standing still, you can see this looks pretty sharp. I mean, this is definitely pretty good looking. All right, let's just go over the settings here. We're at 4K and we're actually on the medium preset. So let's just go down. You can actually see the detail in the world changing when we do this. Right, so let's go down to the low preset. Nothing else is enabled here that I can see. No ray tracing and no upscaling either. Let's just make sure about upscaling. Right, so no upscaling and no DLSS frame generation. Okay, let's see how this goes. I mean, regardless of settings, this looks pretty sharp. Sure, you can definitely increase the visuals by upping the presets a bit, but technically this is not the worst looking game out there on the low preset, right? Sure, you'll miss some visual effects and stuff, but I don't think this is the worst. Sure, motion blur is smoothing over quite a lot of things here. I'll disable that now as soon as these things are dead. I mean, even playing at 30 frames per second, the input latency is actually the mouse is very responsive due to low input latency, right? It's definitely not a bad experience. I usually play this game on a controller anyway. Let's just disable motion blur and see what it looks like. Right, so motion blur is now disabled, and now you can actually see the choppiness of 30 frames per second. So if that bothers you, enable motion blur in fast camera movements. It'll smooth over those. Right, okay, so let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second here. Remember, we're already on the low preset, so there's not much we can change there. We have to rely on upscaling. Right, so let's just go with DLSS balanced and see if that gets us to 60 frames per second. I mean, it's showing 68, 65, so it should be okay. Expect a few dips below 60 frames per second, but this is actually not terrible. I mean, you can just see that some detail is definitely lost. Just look at these plants popping in. That's just what you get if you play on the low preset, but if you prefer 60 frames per second at 4K, then once again, these are the sacrifices that you have to make. Right, once again, this game does support frame generation, so you can probably play on a medium, enable frame generation as long as your base frame rate is above 50 frames per second. You should have no issue, but enabling ray tracing with the 4060 at 4K is just not going to work. All right, so that's Ratchet and Clank at 4K, and let's move on to the next one. Right, and the last game we're going to be testing is Stardew Valley. All right, just before you click off, I'm not really testing Stardew Valley. As you can see, we are getting 60 frames per second here, which is definitely no surprise considering how the game looks. I'm just using this as my last game to talk about some final thoughts here. Now, the 4060 is definitely not a 4K GPU. Sure, you can definitely play at 4K if you don't mind compromising on the visuals quite a lot. And in many titles, we had to use upscaling, so I mean, it's not true 4K, and it's definitely, the end result is not as good as a native in many cases. I think the best is to just stick to 1080p, which this GPU was designed to do. Maybe 1440p if you're feeling very adventurous. But this GPU is definitely capable of providing you a high refresh rate experience at 1080p. If you start using some DLSS and some frame generation, or a solid 60 frames per second at 1440p, in most cases, you'll still have to use DLSS in quite a few games. Cyberpunk, for example, is quite intensive, so you won't be able to get away without upscaling in that game. Many games would be the same at 1440p. So if you want to really play at native, 1080p is definitely the resolution you should be aiming for when you've got a 4060. But the question is, can you play at 4K with an RTX 4060? Well, defining 4K as a native 4K, probably not. Many games run 4K natively on this GPU, but if you want your final output resolution to be 4K by use of upscaling, then you can definitely use an RTX 4060 if you don't mind compromises. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. I just wanted to see if it is actually possible for an RTX 4060 to play at 4K and what the results would be. I mean, I've tested quite a few games with this GPU, not extensively at 4K because personally I don't think it's a 4K GPU, but I mean, now you've got the results. Alright, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.